Forcing the press gang troops forward to join the others, they dragged out one unwilling soldier, a lad of 18 or so, and executed him with a shot in the head. The others moved into the front line with grim faces. Dawn would come within an hour, and with it the red bomber planes and the revelation of the extent of the great column behind us. The officers told me that there were 10 or 20,000 people bunched up here, waiting to cross the railroad to get to the west. Perhaps a quarter of them were civilians or walking wounded. Daylight, surely, would bring a level of destruction on a scale that so far we had not witnessed even in the Kessel. There was no time for preparation or planning. With the aim of breaching the blockade that guarded the railroad, the single SS King Tiger lurched forward into the dark, with our Panthers following in an arrowhead formation. The Stugs beside us and the 2 Wirbelwind flak panzers following among the mix of infantry behind us. The railroad was on an embankment on the skyline, lit by the flames of burning vehicles. I could see its wide, straight line running left and right, and at its foot we had been told that the improvised blockade position consisted of bulldozed earth, logs and sandbags. The greatest danger would come when we breasted the railroad itself. As we rose up over the railroad tracks, our lower hulls would be exposed to whatever was beyond for a few seconds, and an alert Russian PK gunner could put a round through our forward transmission from below. Above the railroad line, the sky appeared to be tinted grey. Was dawn coming so early? The light suddenly brightened, and a long, intense beam shot up into the sky. Inside my Panther, even in the heat and fumes, we all laughed at the sight of that beam. The Russians had switched on an anti-aircraft searchlight. "My God, that will protect them from the mighty Luftwaffe," the loader muttered, peering at the sight through his periscope. "When was the last time you saw the Luftwaffe?" the panzer trainer called up from the hull. "Was it Christmas or before?" It seemed incredible that with their domination of the sky, the Reds would bother with an aerial searchlight. But then another beam joined the first, and then a third, and I could see that these were extremely powerful lights, sending long shafts of brilliant white light up into the smoky air above the railroad. The enemy strong point was still wrapped in shadows below it. As we closed to 500 metres, and there was no reaction from the blockade, the searchlight beams quivered, moved through the air, and then descended directly onto our panzers. Our laughter turned in a moment to shouts of pain and alarm. The lights were dazzling, brighter than any light I had seen before, surely more powerful than any normal anti-aircraft beam. They transformed the space in front of us into a wall of blinding fog, in which it was impossible to make out any perspective or dimensions. My driver slowed, and I used the magnetic compass to keep him driving straight ahead, hoping that the other vehicles would do likewise. Fear gripped my stomach and made my hands shake uncontrollably. We were lit up like showground targets, blind and lost. Over the din of our engine, I heard another vehicle move close to us, collide with our flank and then move off. Then the rapid, chattering fire of 20mm cannons told me that the Wirbelwind had moved in front and was shooting up at the searchlights. We entered a situation of complete anarchy and destruction, even by the standards of combat that I had seen in the East. We were hit by a PK round on our front plate, causing our transmission to shriek. At the same time, the blinding wall of light was cut in half, and I could dimly see flashes to our right as the Wirbelwind blasted its cannon along the railroad embankment. My vision was impaired by the light, and my retina held brilliant shapes that prevented me focusing properly. My gunner cursed and shouted that he had the same problem. He could not focus on the gun sight. This was a new form of weapon from the Reds, a light so blinding that it prevented men from using their weapons. I ordered our driver to steer us to the right, out of the blinding light, into the area of darkness that the Wirbelwind had created. We were hit again by pack rounds, 2 slamming into our turret and blowing the periscope glass down onto me. I could now only see to the front, and there I thought I could make out a wrecked searchlight up on the embankment and 2 more lights sweeping their beams randomly onto our forces. Machine gun and PK fire was coming from the blockade point, only a few hundred metres away. I saw the Whirlwind's quadruple 20mm cannon tear a row of explosions along the top of the embankment, and then another one of the searchlights exploded in brilliant pieces and went dark. The remaining light continued operating, moving up and down the embankment and sweeping its blinding beam over our forces. We almost collided with the SS King Tiger, which was firing with a lowered gun onto the blockade, advancing a few meters between each shot. Unable to see anything else, I ventured my head up out of the cupola. The battle for the railroad was erupting in fits and starts as our men and machines threw themselves at the resistance points, cut down by the enemy guns and dazzled by the powerful light. 2 Stugs had been destroyed, and their crews were clambering out, shielding their eyes against the light. These men were picked off one by one as they tried to jump clear, by machine guns firing from the blockade. 1 Stug exploded in flames, sending its tracks and wheels arching through the air for many meters. Our 2 Whirlwinds were firing defiantly up onto the railroad line, where the remaining searchlight was flashing its blinding cone back and forth over us. Among all this, our infantry were charging the Soviet blockade, running into the light and explosions in ragged groups. I gave instructions to my gunner and aimed our gun roughly at the blockade, and fired our remaining high-explosive rounds into the sandbags and earthen walls. The timber and earth blew up, lifting the Red occupants into the air in a jumble of bodies and debris. A Paquet gun fired on us, the tracer deflecting off the front plate just a few meters below me. But then the Capo's Panther charged past us, firing at 0 range, until he rammed the blockade itself with his bow. His Panther's tracks clawed madly at the mounds of earth, but sank into the debris that our shells had created, becoming stranded. Beside him, the King Tiger moved along the blockade, firing with his lowered gun into each aperture. I ordered my driver to ram the blockade, and we lurched onto the position, as Red machine gunners shot at us from either side, with their bullets smacking off our armoured hull. My driver used the differential expertly to rotate the Panzer and crush the dug-in positions, and then, on my order, we began to mount the embankment beyond the blockade. That last high-powered searchlight began to turn onto us, and I saw that this was a device mounted on a T-34 chassis, with a huge projection disc bigger than any searchlight I had seen, even in the Reich. We reached the ridge of the embankment and rammed the machine before it turned its beam fully onto us, knocking it sideways. The T-34 hull span off down the slope on the other side of the ridge, with the powerful beam now directed west towards the red lines. Perhaps this saved us, because a storm of tracer rounds flew up at us from the land beyond, but all the shots went wide. The searchlight Panzer caught fire and began to burn, as its massive lens burst open and the light died. My Panther gripped the stones of the railroad line itself, and I felt the thump of each railroad girder as we passed over the top, and then we crashed down onto the obverse slope, where we knew nothing about the forces ranged against us. We ploughed to a halt on a slope of loose stones. My cupola periscopes were cracked and dusty, making forward vision difficult. When I was sure that we were below the skyline, so that I was less of a target for snipers, I went up through the cupola to see what was in front of us. Dawn was close, that much was evident. Not the false, blinding dawn of the power searchlights, but a blue mark across the sky. Below us, Red infantry were retreating, running from us over the earthworks which we Germans had built to defend the zone. In the distance, as the land fell away to the east, I saw a corridor of flames and explosions which surely marked the limit of the 12th Army's advance. If we could make it to that corridor, we would have a chance of making it onward to the Elbe. The dawn light rose as the remaining vehicles and infantry of our assault group reared up over the railroad lines and slithered down the slope. None of the Stugs had survived. 1 Whirlwind was intact, and another joined us as a chassis tractor with its open turret blasted away. The SS King Tiger laboured over the ridge in the grey light, with flames licking around its engine bay. The huge machine shuddered and ground to a halt, its tracks sinking into the loose stones as its crew extinguished the flames. The infantry had survived at a rate of perhaps 40% or less. The Fallschirmjäger came in ones and twos over the railroad, shouldering their guns and with their faces set under masks of dust. The Volkssturm people came supporting each other, trailing their Panzerfausts behind them, boys carrying the old men and vice versa. The Wehrmacht troops came over with their Kettenhund gang behind them, the soldiers reduced to a platoon, and their escorts down to 2 men. With this ragged bunch of men and machines, we had crossed the last barrier that remained before the Elbe and our salvation. But what of the capo? Despite the urgency, I ran back over the railroad to look for him. The capo's Panther was stuck fast on the eastern side of the ridge, its tracks ripped off and its transmission burned out. In 5 minutes we had drained its fuel and ammunition and added them to my Panther, and then we blew the Panther up with a demolition charge. I looked back to see the engine blown out through the grills. Around it, a great mass of people was already starting to make its way west. The thousands of foot soldiers, stragglers and civilians that had emerged from the Kessel overnight. I installed the capo and his crew on my Panther, and we followed the single King Tiger as it spearheaded the way to the west. Behind us, the sprawling column followed at a running pace, horses, carts, men and women on foot, and numerous motorcycles, a few cars and Hanemags. I could not count the people, but I guessed at 4,000 or 5,000 that I could see, with many more evidently still behind them. For many of these people, though, their journey was about to end. As the dawn broke, the sky behind us, to the east, erupted in red, not the red of sunrise, but the orange and black explosions of Katyusha incendiary rockets. The explosions were tearing across the mass of people advancing over the railroad, sending men, women and children flying through the air in flames, throwing horses, wagons and vehicles end over end in spouts of fire. The people close to the railroad began to run like demons, the wounded dragging themselves, soldiers throwing away their guns, civilians becoming trampled in the mob. The breakout was being sealed by the bombardment, with a line of pure fire that prevented any further Germans from coming west. Before I turned away, I saw a single horse charge through the wall of flames, streaming fire, his rider dead in the saddle. Nothing else came through that curtain of death, except pieces of debris and burning liquid. Those few thousand of us that had crossed the railroad quickly accelerated, fleeing the incendiary bombardment, knowing that each moment made it more likely that we would be caught in the firestorm like those we left behind. Reaching the Elbe. Our column of a few thousand now moved through a landscape seemingly untouched by the war. There was no road, so our panzers moved slowly between copses of oaks and orchards of apple and pear trees, hiding as best we could in each area of cover before dashing on to the next. The foot traffic followed us, but the human column was thinning out as people gave up in exhaustion or from their wounds, and lay down to accept their destiny. In the occasional house that we found, the civilian occupants urged our troops to enter and remove their uniforms, and to put on the work clothes of absent menfolk. Some of our troops accepted the offer and disappeared into the houses. There was little attempt to stop them. We all knew that each person now had to face the end of the war as he or she best could. Small fires appeared in the yards of the houses, where uniforms and insignia were burned. Many of these houses took in women and children who were too tired or fearful to continue, and many civilians left our column in this way. And yet, as the day continued, the sky overhead remained clear of Soviet aircraft, and the sound of the terrible explosions behind us did not come any closer to us. Again, as our Panther creaked and rattled behind the King Tiger in the lead, I had the feeling that the Reds, for their own reasons, were allowing us to advance towards the 12th Army, and then the Elbe. Our group was so small that we could see our flanks in the fields on either side, the left and right of each column being guarded by the most able-bodied infantry, mostly the Fallschirmjäger or SS men. At times they shouted a warning, and Russian armoured cars appeared in the distance. The Red vehicles did not fire on us, and this added to our confusion. The rumour went through the column that the war must be officially over, and that we had missed the momentous announcement. Why else would the Reds stand and observe us without shooting? As the kilometres passed, we became sure that this was the case, that the Reds were now under orders not to fire on us, and our hearts lifted at the thought. We estimated that we had perhaps 10 kilometres further to travel before we reached the 12th Army's positions, and the corridor that would lead us to the Americans on the Elbe. As we left the cover of a beechwood, we rounded a copse of trees to find a group of German soldiers standing in front of the King Tiger. "German troops!" my gunner said, with a yell of excitement. "We've made it! We are through to the 12th!" I put a hand on my MP40, remembering the Seydlitz men that had tricked our people at Halbe. Beside me, the capo, standing beside the turret, had his pistol ready, and he gave me an order in a low voice to proceed carefully. The Panther ground to a halt beside the King Tiger, and we studied the German troops in front of us. They were grimy, unshaven, and their uniforms were ragged. They looked hungry and scared. In answer to our challenge, they said that they were Panzer Grenadiers of the 12th Army, and their insignia matched this, unlike the Seydlitz brigades who wore no emblems. They said that the road ahead was mined, and they had been sent to guide any breakout groups through the fields. "In 5 kilometres you will be in the corridor," their Feldwebel called up to us. "Many people are passing through there to reach the Americans." "Is the war over?" we called down. "No, but the Reds are going slow today. They had their May Day celebrations last night. They know they have won the war. Lots of red vodka and ladies for them. See there?" 2 Russian soldiers were asleep under a bush beside the road, surrounded by empty bottles. The German troops had taken their machine pistols as souvenirs. Of course, it was the day after the great Red Communist Festival, May the 1st, or May Day. It sounded plausible that the Reds would be hung over on this morning, and with the war so close to ending, perhaps they would be less inclined to pursue us. "We should make the most of this," the King Tiger commander called to me, "before the Reds sober up." We took these 12th Army German troops up onto our panzers among the wounded, and we followed their directions. It was mid-morning by now, clear and warm, and the unscarred landscape was full of meadows, orchards, and timbered houses. The foot traffic followed behind us, a ragged column stretching for several hundred metres in the bright sunlight, men shouldering their weapons, supporting each other and stumbling in exhaustion. Other men with no guns, walking in a daze, civilians stooping to drink from animal troughs by the gates between the fields. The 12th Army soldiers guided us down into a road that ran in a cutting between 2 higher fields on either side, a sunken road with walls of chalk growing with ferns and wild roses. The scent of these flowers was noticeable even over the stink of the panzer and our bodies. It was a scent that suggested to my exhausted mind that we were finally going home. We halted at the command of the guides, who then jumped off and went ahead on foot to reconnoitre. "We'll check for Reds and come back to you," they shouted. We waited, with the engines cut out to save fuel, the King Tiger in front and my Panther behind. There was the contraction of the engines, the moaning of the wounded, the singing of birds and the tramping of feet coming to a halt as the walking column behind us caught up and halted too. The capo, standing on my rear deck and leaning on the turret, wiped his face on his sleeve and muttered a prayer that our journey was over. A few minutes later, a person appeared on the edge of the sunken road. He was an officer, his hands on his hips and his pistol holstered. He was Russian. Our troops raised their guns to aim at him, but we held fire as the red officer stared down at us. One by one, other red troops appeared above us on the edges of the cutting. Fresh infantry with almond-coloured faces, clean uniforms, guns that looked straight from the factory. 50 or 60 of them stood there on either side, looking down on us. I don't know if the 2 drunken soldiers from under the roadside bush were among them, but I suspected that they were. Finally, one of our German 12th Army guides appeared beside the officer and shouted to us, "Comrades, there is no point in fighting any more. The war is not over yet, but it will be over in days or hours." There were jeers and insults from the panzer crews and the troops in the sunken road, but still nobody fired a shot. "Listen to me," the German defector shouted. "Those people who followed after you from the Kessel at the railroad crossing point. Remember them? They are all dead. Not one of them is alive this morning. The Russians can do as they please with us these days." "And what do they want with us in this column?" the capo shouted to the German. "Why have they trapped us here?" "You must understand," the defector shouted back. "Among the Russian officers there is competitiveness. The war has become a sport for them. They are playing games with the Germans now." "What do they want?" I demanded. "The panzers," the defector called. "Give this red officer your panzers in working order without damage and leave all the women here. You panzer crews and infantry can go on ahead on foot, but you must leave your civilians here." The commander of the SS King Tiger turned around in his cupola to look at me on my panther. We did not speak, but his face was set in stone. He turned back and began speaking to his crew in the hull. "Comrades, give them the panzers," the defector pleaded. "They want the vehicles in working condition. They want to send them back to Moscow for their parades and their ceremonies. That is all. They will let your men pass through here in return. Even the SS can pass through. This officer is the only Red who will make you this offer. There are other Red officers around who will kill you for sure. Comrades, the war is lost. Accept this offer." The King Tiger started its engine in a sudden roar of fumes and jerked forward a few meters in an aggressive show, making the Russian troops step away from the edge of the sunken channel. The SS Tiger commander stood tall in his cupola, outlined against the sky. I saw the German defector's mouth moving, his hands outstretched as he pleaded with us, and then I told my driver to start up too, and the Panther crashed into life in a cloud of oily smoke. I don't know who fired the first shot, but from then on the sunken road became a place of death for us all. German, Russians, soldiers, and civilians. Through my engine smoke, I saw a bullet pass through the German defector's head, exiting from the back of his skull in a cloud of red and white against the blue. The Red officer beside him was shot through the stomach and doubled up, his face contorted. The Russian troops along the edge of the channel initially stumbled back, perhaps confused by the lack of leadership. But then they clearly decided to perform their duty as their training dictated. They began firing down onto us in the sunken road, raking the panzers and the foot column behind with their machine gun fire. I heard the capo grunt in pain and saw him tumble off the Panther, falling among the people on foot who were beginning to scatter up and down the roadway. The capo was hit again, repeatedly, and I knew that there was no hope for him, that he was now one of the many fallen of the Kessel who would surely have no grave or headstone. One of his crewmen leaped down from the Panther and went to the capo's side. All that could be done was to remove his iron cross from around his neck, and this was thrown up to me on the Panther's deck. In all the danger and confusion, it was a point of honour to us that a dead man's Iron Cross medal should not fall into enemy hands, but be returned to the wearer's family. The King Tiger in front of us lurched forward again, its tracks demolishing the rose-covered walls of the channel, causing a landslide that brought several Red troops tumbling down under our treads. I remained up on the turret roof, and, with the capo's Iron Cross in my hand, I shot at the Red soldiers with my MP40, even as the Panther crunched forward over the landslide and juddered after the King Tiger, aiming for the higher ground where this sunken road came up into the meadows. Grenades exploded on the rear of the King Tiger, the shrapnel streaming back at my Panzer, and I saw the rear deck of the Tiger burn with flame for a moment. That huge 70-ton vehicle leapt up out of the sunken track, its whole front end losing contact with the ground, and then slammed down in the pastures beyond. I saw the commander in his cupola shot through with Russian bullets, his body jerking as he was hit. The King Tiger rolled straight on at 20 kph straight ahead, aiming west, with flames streaming from its engines. Then my Panther, too, was up on the grassland beside that Panzer, and we ploughed forward side by side until I told my driver to rotate back and return to the land beside the sunken road. We drove back in a cloud of dust to find the Red troops firing down into the path. They were firing off entire magazines and then reloading and firing again. In my hull, the Panzer training man opened up with his MP40, and in the turret we depressed the gun elevation and fired off our remaining coaxial MG bullets at the Red troops. We cut them down in a long, scything motion, throwing them off one side of the channel and then the other side. I jumped down from the Panther with my MP40 and ran to the edge of the sunken road and looked in. The foot column was decimated in there. Infantry, wounded, civilians and horses were jumbled up in heaps of kicking limbs. The able-bodied were emerging from that carnage and running towards my Panther, dragging a few civilians and walking wounded with them. In this way, perhaps 100 people came out of that sunken track and fell in behind the Panther as it turned and moved out onto the plain. Walking with them behind the Panther, I urged them on, men, women and children, shouting at them to speed up as best they could while we stumbled and tripped after the Panther as it rattled across the meadow to the west. I could see a copse of trees beyond the meadow, with good dark foliage that might shield us, and I knew that my Panther crew would head for that immediately. The King Tiger, however, was still careering away from us over the pasture, with flames pouring around the back of its deck. Overhead there was the scream of aero engines, and the stark profiles of Sturmovix stood against the glare. 3 of them were swooping on us, cannon beginning to bark over the noise of the Panther engine. We who were running on foot threw ourselves flat on the sweet grass, and saw the red planes pass overhead, one after the other, the 3 aircraft all aiming for the King Tiger. I do not believe that the Tiger's crew intended to save us or meant to draw the Russian fire by driving out into the open pasture, trailing smoke. I think it was a matter of those 70 tons travelling at speed, on a downward slope, perhaps with a transmission jammed in gear while the crew compartment filled with fumes. Whatever the cause, the massive King Tiger charged away from us, out on its own, with the body of the commander slumped on the turret and fire flickering around its backplate. The Sturmovix shot the Panzer up with ruthless accuracy, piercing the engine deck and turret roof with their shells. I saw the engine grills fly off in pieces, and large scabs of metal from the turret spin off from the sides. As my column hurried into the comparative safety of the trees, the Jarbos turned around and came back for another run. The King Tiger was still moving, leaving a trail of flames and smoke behind it. The cannon shells tore one track off, making the whole vehicle rear up on one side and then slam down, shedding wheels and track links. Still rolling, the hull erupted in a puff of flames until only the colossal gun barrel was visible, emerging from the fireball. Of the crew there was no sign whatever. We, the survivors of the entire column, now only 100 infantry and civilians plus my creaking Panther, pushed deeper into the pine woods, still heading west. The pine forest was man-made and laid out on a geometric pattern with fire breaks and access roads at regular intervals. Apart from these open fire breaks, which were narrow, the pine trees screened us overhead, although we heard the noise of planes passing over very low at times. The first thing that we encountered in the first firebreak were the bodies of the same 12th Army German infantrymen who had led us into the sunken road. They were lying face down and had all been executed with shots in the back. Stepping over their bodies, I climbed back onto the Panther to take command of the vehicle for this final stage of the breakout. The Panzer was in a hopeless state. The left and right tracks were on different tensions, making the vehicle veer to one side, and the engine grills gave out a constant acrid smoke. I could hear the transmission front drive whining in the hull, and I guessed that it might last another 10 or 20 kilometres. Driving down the narrow but evenly surfaced road between the fir trees improved our fuel use, but it also meant that we could not traverse the turret more than a few degrees, as our gun barrel was obstructed by the trees. Only in the junctions between the road and the firebreak channels, which ran left and right at intervals of about 1,000 metres, could we turn our gun to the side, and we soon found that these junctions were to be feared. As we approached the first one, our infantry reconnoitred ahead and gestured to us that the way was clear. We moved the Panther forward to the gap, then surged across the few meters of exposure where the firebreak extended into the distance on either side. We paused between the trees beyond to let the foot traffic make the crossing too. The first dozen troops and civilians hurried across, keeping their heads low. As a second group stepped out, shots came from the firebreak to the left, and a civilian man tumbled onto his front and went still. Another shot felled a Fallschirmjäger who was helping a wounded woman to cross, and the bullet seemed to pass through him and hit the woman also. She lay, squirming on top of the paratrooper's dead body until she also was hit by the sniper, her head emitting a cloud of blood before she went limp. I could see no sign of the sniper, no smoke or movements. I had the Panther reverse across the open space to form a barrier, and the people surged across in its cover. From inside the turret, I heard bullets smacking off our armour plate, and I feared that the Reds would use an anti-tank rifle or rocket launcher on us. We traversed the turret and fired a precious high-explosive round into the trees, which went zigzagging from one tree trunk to another before exploding further down the firebreak. When I saw that the last of the people had crossed, I moved the Panther forward. In this way, we crossed 3 firebreaks, each time losing a handful of people to snipers on the left or right, but each time bringing with us the bulk of the column. At one point, the Reds tried to mortar us, but their rounds deflected off the trees before they fell and burst in the air some distance away. Some of our troops were wounded by this shrapnel, and we had to leave them where they fell, still clutching their guns. At the next firebreak, we cut the Panther's engine entirely, and in the sudden silence I heard shots from behind us, where the wounded had been left. Whether that was a sniper or the wounded killing themselves, it was impossible to say. Finally, we saw the edge of the forest ahead of us, an area of smoke at the end of the forest track under a clear sky. We did not pause, but accelerated towards it as we could see Red infantry moving between the trees around us, following our progress. When we broke out of the forest itself, we came onto an area of burned ground, still smouldering, which was strewn with wrecked vehicles and charred bodies. A row of Panzer Haifis stood there, blackened with fire, lined up as if on an inspection parade. The corpses of their crews were jammed in the hatches, with ravens perched on their limbs. We steered around this spectacle, believing that the corridor held open by the 12th Army was now very close. I estimated that it was 1 kilometre or so, and on either side we heard sporadic fighting, suggesting that the enemy were pushing into the corridor with every moment that passed. We aimed towards a gap between low hills, which I believed led to Jüterbog, where the 12th Army should be. The distance from the burned ground to that gap was barely a kilometre, but the ground was uneven, and the Panther could only proceed at walking pace, with the column stumbling in our wake. We crossed 100 metres, with the Panther juddering as if it was about to explode, then another 100, and by now the survivors of our column were breaking into a hobbling, frantic run, drawing on their last reserves of energy and hope to make this final dash. I saw a group of houses ahead, which I thought might be the outskirts of Jüterbog. Artillery began to fall on us, heavy-caliber field guns which lifted great chunks out of the ground and scattered them into dust. These explosions fell to our right, with debris cutting down a few of our people on that side as they ran. Then the Red gunners recalibrated, and the shells fell across our front, making a curtain of explosions that we would have to run through. I dropped down into the turret, hearing the smash of shrapnel and stones against the armour plate. One shell landed close to us, and the pressure wave made the whole Panther flatten and then bounce up as it passed over us. The shock wave moved through the Panzer, making blood spurt from my nose and leaving my ears ringing. I realised that the engine had died, and I could dimly hear the driver trying to start it. I decided that the Panther was probably finished and told the crew to exit and find shelter before the whole vehicle was turned over by an explosion. We stumbled out of the Panzer and threw ourselves onto the ground near the houses. Our column was already taking shelter there, The shattered windows and doors revealed huddled groups with their hands over their heads. I glimpsed a group of Soviet infantry, too, on the edge of the houses, also seeking cover, caught in the open by their own bombardment. I saw a house with a basement window at ground level, its shutters hanging open, and I jumped in there. Ducking down into the basement, I found that it was occupied by several small children, girls of 6 or 7 years, and 2 women. The women had the children huddled to them, and their faces were clenched in fear. The explosions outside made the whole floor lift up, and pieces of masonry were starting to fall from the walls. As bricks fell loose among us, a pair of boots appeared at the foot of the steps, and a man crashed into the refuge, followed by another man. They crouched on the floor, staring at us. They were Russians. They were young, barely 20, and they wore thin tunics, backpacks, and steel helmets. The red star on their chest pockets glowed bright in the light from the stairs. Each man was holding a cylinder drum machine pistol. They looked at me, at the children and women, and then at the flashes of explosions at the top of the stairs. Then they just shrugged and sat back against the opposite wall, their guns in their hands, not taking their eyes off us. I could feel the weight of my pistol in my holster. The Reds showed no sign of violence, despite my uniform. One of them grinned at the children and winked, making explosion noises in his throat. A shell burst outside made dust pour from the ceiling. The children flinched and whimpered. This cheerful Russian reached into his pocket and showed the children a picture of his family. The children looked at it in silence, then they looked at me expectantly. Keen to reassure them, I fumbled out the photo of the unknown young woman in my pocket and showed it to them. Everybody nodded in approval. The children, the women, and the 2 Russian lads. Debris was still falling onto us from the explosions. One of the soldiers took his steel helmet off, reached it out, and placed it on the head of one little girl, saying something in Russian. The girl's head was almost concealed by the green steel helmet. The man leaned back, bareheaded. There was a shell burst directly in the doorway at the top of the stairs, and debris flew down the steps onto us all. I ducked, covering my head, and threw myself in front of the children. I heard shrapnel smashing down the stairs and hitting the walls around us. I looked up. The bare-headed Russian man had been hit in the forehead. Where his helmet would have protected him, a long piece of shrapnel projected from the wound. He looked dead. His friend was checking his pulse, feeling for signs of life, and then muttering angrily. His eyes burning, he stared at the child with the green helmet, and reached for his gun. I shot him twice in the chest, then leaned across and shot him again in the head, while the children screamed. The bodies lay there in front of us while the shelling went on. When there appeared to be a lull in the bombardment, I told the women to come with me, to leave that place and join our journey to the west. They refused, preferring to stay in their cellar, whatever the outcome. To save them from more trouble than they already faced, I called to my crewmen and we pulled the Russian bodies out of the cellar and left them in a crater some distance away from the houses. The foot column was slowly reassembling from the shattered buildings, with people emerging in 1s and 2s. After several attempts, my crew started the Panther again, and we formed up our column and then moved on towards the gap in the hills. The next troops that we saw were German, and they called to us to keep moving, that the 12th Army was directly ahead. These troops were guarding an 88mm gun and a pair of Hetzer destroyers which were dug in to guard the hills, so we believed that they were not defectors. We began to find more troops dug into foxholes or manning gun emplacements, who told us that the 12th Army corridor was still open for us. With the Panther at walking speed, our ragged, bleeding convoy moved into the corridor itself, and we began to move on towards the west. The corridor was barely 3 kilometres wide, and on each side there were towers of smoke and constant gunfire, as the German 12th Army screens there tried to hold off the Soviet pincers that were seeking to crush the safety zone. Red planes raced overhead, but there was a strong flak cover here, with 20mm flak wagons using plentiful ammunition. We saw a Sturmovik shot down, with its wings crumpling as it twisted around on fire, and slammed into one of the hills beside us. The centre of this corridor was full of targets for the Red Jarbos, columns of troops that had made it through the encirclements and the pockets to the east, single panzers such as ours, and a few groups of armour, many horses, and hand-carts for the civilians. The few farmhouses in this region were burning fiercely, many with improvised cemeteries in their yards instead of vegetable gardens and animal paddocks. One yard contained a T-34 upside down in a crater, and another had a complete Stuka Panzerbuster aircraft just sitting in its grazing meadow, with its canopy hanging open, surrounded by dead cattle with their hooves in the air. Everywhere were foot soldiers or civilians, scavenging as they trudged west, beneath trees whose branches were blackened with incendiary fires. If some among us had imagined that the 12th Army Zone would be a place of safety, it became clear that the danger here was still very great. At one point, the protective screen on our left seemed to give way, and German 12th Army infantry began streaming back into the centre zone, in full retreat, adding to the confusion around us. Officers halted them with shots over their heads, and several troops who had thrown their weapons away were shot dead out of hand. Still, the breach in the defences was there, barely a kilometre from us, and the sound of tanks came through between the shell bursts. From up in the cupola, I saw two of our Stugs emerge from concealment beside the road and head towards the danger point. The crews of these Stugs were young teenagers, perhaps 16 years of age, and they must have known that they were going to their deaths. They went with blank faces, their eyes wide with amphetamines and fear. I traversed my Panther and moved in support of them, and although my vehicle would now only operate in second gear, we travelled a few hundred metres through the trees and scrub between us and the screen of the corridor. We passed a staff car among the bushes, which contained two Wehrmacht majors, both middle-aged but fit and unwounded, both simply waiting in their fine car for the passage to be secured for them by the sacrifice of the young men. We clipped the car in passing, tearing off a wheel, and we moved to a firing position, from which we could just see the edge of the corridor itself. The situation out there was desperate. The two Stugs were firing on a phalanx of T-34s, which were nosing in on a gap in the defences. An 88mm PK gun was also firing from a bunker, and remnants of our infantry were crouched in slit trenches and craters, clutching Panzerfausts. A group of Volkssturm men, aged in their 50s, marched past us rapidly, Panzerfausts and carbines held ready to help fill the gap. These men were immediately hit by a shell burst, and their bodies were dismembered across the ground. A gang of Hiwis, the Russian collaborators who feared recapture by the Reds more than anything, ran forward and seized the dead men's guns. These Russian defectors threw themselves into the battle with the reckless courage of men whose death sentence was already passed. My gunner fired on the leading T-34, stopping it dead, and two German troops rushed forward with Panzerfausts to finish it. The rockets tore off the front plate of the Red Panzer, while the Red crew were still trying to scramble out of the hatches. The T-34 began to explode from inside, with main gun ammunition bursting out of the fractured hull in spirals of smoke and sparks. My Panther was hit by the other T-34s, and a shell split the front edge of our turret so that I could see daylight between the wall and the roof. Another shell hit our front plate and bounced upward in a spray of debris. I told the gunner to fire all our remaining ammunition, and with those few remaining rounds, we hit another T-34, which was charging on our AT-8 Meteor's position. We knocked the turret right off that Panzer, but the hull kept rolling forward, lurching wildly, until it ploughed into the Paquet emplacement and crushed the 80mm crew under its tracks. On my orders, my Panther began to reverse, with nothing by way of fuel or ammunition left to fight with, as the Stugs and their teenage crews fought on, firing again and again at the ranks of T-34s, rolling in from the fields beyond. From somewhere, two fresh Panthers came to join the defence, vehicles that seemed to be direct from the factory, in perfect paint and equipment fitted to the hulls. As we reversed away and moved back towards the central zone, we saw many of the Hiwi men, finishing their ammunition, stand up and walk towards the T-34s, deliberately exposing themselves to the deadly fire. For the Hiwis, it was better to die like that, quickly and anonymously, than spend the rest of their lives in the Gulag, knowing that, because of their collaboration, their families were sharing that fate too. The two infantry majors whose car we had just clipped tried to flag us down, demanding a ride, brandishing their pistols. I was not in the frame of mind to suffer these fools, and so I jumped down from the turret and disarmed them. We checked their car and found 2 full cans of gasoline in the back. 2 full cans! That was enough for another 30 kilometres. The 2 officers scowled as we filled our tank, then offered us a box of gold watches if we would accept them as passengers. We took 2 Panzerfausts from some Volkssturm men rushing past us and armed the 2 majors with these, sending them up to the front line with kicks from our hobnail boots. The Volkssturm assured us that the officers would be a valuable resource, worth a whole platoon of Panthers, and began driving them on with their carbines. The perimeters of the corridor were shrinking every minute. The red planes circled overhead, weaving between the flak, firing into the fleeing columns or unloading fragmentation bombs along our route. These bombs separated in the air into smaller containers of explosives, which scattered wildly over a huge area, exploding in torrents of ball bearings and shrapnel. I thought that I was immune to the sight of death and injury, but the sights we saw on that final few kilometres were astonishing. A civilian bus, commandeered by staff officers, was bogged down in a rut and hit by a fragmentation burst. The thin sides of the bus were ripped open, and the bodies of the officers inside tumbled out onto the road, the wounded lying untended as the passing foot soldiers stepped over them. A group of political prisoners in their striped pyjama uniforms were being employed to pull wagons full of possessions, suitcases, paintings and furniture, under the command of an SS unit. A red plane shot up the whole procession, sending the paintings in their gilded frames flying through the air and knocking down the prisoners along with the SS. The prisoners who survived ran or stumbled off into the trees towards the perimeter, some clutching the guns taken from the dead SS men. A house we passed had 2 elderly men strung up on nooses from its shutters, with a sign around their necks. We showed a white flag to the red monsters. The white flag itself was draped around the dead men's bodies, swaying in the breeze. A group of armed civilian women had cornered a Russian infantryman inside the corridor and were asking the passing troops what to do with the man. He stood, bareheaded and sullen, while his fate was discussed. Nobody was interested in him, and the women simply shot him through the head with a pistol, then climbed onto a passing wagon. A red fighter plane was hit by flak high overhead, and the aircraft smashed nose down into the trees, turning an ancient oak into a blazing torch as high as a church steeple. The pilot came down on a parachute and became entangled on branches across the road further on. He hung there, 10 metres overhead, trying to free himself, the subject of disinterested glances from those trudging past, until somebody shot him through the body. Metre by metre, we began to leave this zone, entering an area where there were patches of long, narrow meadows shielded by fir trees. In some of these meadows, German aircraft had tried to land, perhaps escaping from the east and finishing their fuel here. One field had an abandoned Focke-Wulf fighter, simply standing in the grass, its engine cowling steaming in the light. In another field, a Junkers 52 plane had crash-landed on its belly, and a man of general rank was kneeling on the ground nearby, retching into the grass. A few minutes later, beyond the trees, we saw shapes moving in another one of these lush pastures. I could see a glint of metal through the mist, and there was a smell of gasoline in the area. I dismounted from the Panther and went forward with one of the infantrymen to see what was happening in there. I expected to see red tanks manoeuvring into position, or isolated elements of our armour in hiding, sitting out the surrounding battles. Instead, as we crept forwards between the trees, machine pistols in our hands, we saw a sight that few Germans were ever privileged to see. Through the mist, as the sun burned off the vapour, the glimpses of pale metal turned to a definite outline, which at first was blurred by the mist, but then became clear. In a few moments, as the metal object moved across the secluded pasture, both I and the infantryman with me drew breath and lowered our guns. The object was an aircraft, of a design that we had seen in the newsreels and soldiers' magazines, presented to us as the greatest of its type, but surely none of us ever believed that we would see one in person. This was a Messerschmitt 262, the legendary jet-powered Schwalbe or Swan, the sleek and beautiful twin-engined creation that was one of our wonder weapons. I was astonished at how big it was. In the newsreels it seemed so much smaller, and I was astonished too at the crude nature of its construction. Its metal panels were evidently hammered by hand, and their metal skin was unpainted except for the German cross on its fuselage and the swastika on its tail fin. "No propellers!" one of the foot soldiers said to himself. "Hier ist Wunder! Here's a miracle!" The aircraft was balanced on its wheels, which were sinking into the lush turf. It was being dragged by a team of oxen, the simple wagon-pulling oxen that had been bred in this part of Germany for thousands of years. The oxen were roped together, and the rope was looped around the 262's undercarriage, and metre by metre those ancient beasts, guided by a farm boy of 10 years of age, were dragging the jet plane through the grass towards the safety of the trees. We common soldiers stood mute at this sight. What did this mean for us, and for Germany? Our wonder weapons existed. They were there in front of our eyes, and they were superbly designed with the greatest science that humankind could summon. But the machine was crudely made, it was uneven, and it was being hauled like a medieval cart on its wheels by a gang of oxen, each animal trailing a cloud of flies from its arse. And it was leaking fuel. Splashes of liquid were pouring from its hull, making the whole forest reek. "Don't light a cigarette, my friends, or you're all finished." A Luftwaffe pilot squatted beside us, grinning. He was middle-aged, and he looked exhausted, with hollow cheeks and thin hair oiled over a balding skull. His flying boots were perfectly polished, but his moustache was yellow with nicotine. He gave us an account of how he had brought the plane down in an emergency landing on the pasture, leaking the precious jet fuel that was more valuable to the Reich than gold. "But how shall I get to the west now?" he murmured. "Everything is lost. Perhaps I shall have a cigarette anyway when you are safely gone." We shook hands with him, eager to clasp the hand of a legend. Our complaints, our bitter jokes about the Luftwaffe were forgotten for a minute as we watched the superb aircraft being pulled into the shadow of the elm trees, where it was to be stored, the pilot told us, until it could somehow be returned to service. As we left the thicket, the lowing of the oxen began, a sound that I recognized as the beasts of burden being unyoked from their load. A minute after that, the whole corner of the forest behind us was lit up, and we turned to see a colossal orange fireball climbing into the air above the trees. The fireball was dripping with burning fuel, rolling over as it rose, so hot that it burned the mist from the treetops for hundreds of metres around. The farm boy who had driven the oxen came running after us, shouting hysterically. "He lit a cigarette, the fool, as if he wanted to die." Slowly, these scenes and many others fell behind us, and the sounds of fighting from the perimeter became more distant. Our panzer creaked and rattled at walking pace through a smokescreen, our eyes streaming with tears which we had not shed in the battles, and entered a zone which appeared to be organised in some manner of discipline. Kettenhund men were directing the traffic onward, and the improvised defences and emplacements gave way to properly constructed ditches and trenches. The troops here were a mixture of the completely fresh and the exhausted, and the equipment likewise was both new and old. A number of immaculate PK guns, their wheels barely muddy, were manned by gunners who resembled scarecrows, thin and ragged. A unit of Hitler Youth troops, in clean uniforms and recent haircuts, were manning a defence point that consisted of an old Panzer III with no wheels or tracks, standing in a mound of barbed wire. The troops were from a great variety of units and regiments, including armed police and Volkssturm men. Amazingly, there were field kitchens too, giving a ladleful of hot soup to anyone, soldier or civilian, who passed. I ate my ration on the Panther's rear deck, leaning on the turret, surrounded by wounded men and children. The engine smoke coated us with grime, and the fumes made us nauseous, but we were properly inside the 12th Army sector, heading for the Elbe. As we rolled past a group of soldiers clustered around an armoured car, one of them turned to us and shouted something. I didn't catch it, but some of the children heard and began to tug my sleeve. "Feldwebel." "What is it, lad?" "The Führer is dead now." We stopped at the next group of troops and listened to their radio set for a few minutes. It announced that Adolf Hitler had died in the fight for Berlin, only 30 kilometres to the north of us. The war continued all the same, in the hope of a final victory. Some women were weeping, and some of the troops stood around, talking openly of suicide. I felt little, except for the pain in my back wound, for which I took the last of my drugs. The 12th Army sector around Brandenburg in front of the Elbe was a landscape of destruction and constant movement. The perimeter was being held by the remnants of the 12th and the escaped 9th Armies, but the whole zone was being pressed heavily by the Reds, except for the Elbe itself on the western boundary, which faced the silent, unmoving Americans on their bank. Vast columns of vehicles and people were making their way across the rolling countryside towards the river. The Reds controlled the sky despite our flak, and their Jabos came over frequently, strafing the columns, the buildings, and the open land. We knew that if the Russians wanted to, they could bomb the sector into dust. They were holding back, waiting for the end of the war, and perhaps seeking to maximize their catch of humanity. Leaflets cascaded down from the sky, urging everyone in the sector to remain static and stop resisting the advance of the Red Army. "Hitler is dead. Berlin has surrendered. The war has no logic and it must end now." In addition, voices spoke to us through loudspeakers amplified at incredibly high volume. These were the voices of Seydlitz officers, and the warm spring breeze carried them for kilometres across the landscape. The words were indistinct, but we caught surrender, peace, life, goodwill, and a few others. We listened to this, and the drone of the aircraft overhead, as we joined a massive flood of people heading towards the river. It was rare now to see armed troops. Most had thrown away their weapons, and they walked with hands in their pockets or supporting their backpacks. Most epaulettes and other signs of rank had been removed from their uniforms, and the meadows were scattered with badges, caps, and jackboots. Men's civilian clothing was prized now, and many men who wore the trousers and shirt of farm workers had the bearing of recent professional soldiers. Schnapps and other alcohol was in ample supply, and many people were to be seen lying drunk beside the road, desensitized to whatever they had witnessed and whatever fears possessed them. The fields and roadsides were lined with abandoned vehicles, both mechanized and horse-drawn. There were a few panzers among the trucks, Kubelwagens and cars, but it seemed that most armoured vehicles had been left behind in the Kessel and the other battle zone. Our Panther was the only one of its type that we saw, and it was close to dying under us. At a junction in the roads, a huge crater barred the way to heavy vehicles, and the foot traffic crossed on a wooden bridge. We tried to take the Panther around this obstacle into the meadows, but the fields close to the river were marshy, and the tracks soon sank in deeply. There was no benefit in trying to make the machine go on any further. The River Elbe was within walking distance, the fuel was gone, and the engine was in danger of catching fire. We drove the old Panzer further into the marshes, knowing this was the end, and not wanting the machine to fall into any other hands, either Russian, American, or even German. With the wounded and the civilians lifted off, we drove the Panther in second gear for a few more metres, until it hit a stretch of water surrounded by bulrushes. It began to subside, the engine end going down first. We jumped clear and watched it sink. With fumes rising into the air, the front plate rose up, the long gun barrel dripping with marsh water. The cupola, from which I had seen so much and given so many orders in the heat of combat, filled up with the stagnant water and slid below the surface. There were some final bubbles and fumes. I stood there in silence as the green weeds gathered over the Panther, and, when the surface was still, I turned with my crew and we walked at the head of our small column along the choked roads down to the great river Elbe. The approaches to the river were packed with people of all types, civilians, unarmed troops, and some combat troops who still carried their weapons. Among these were Waffen-SS men of the Panzer Corps who were pushing through the crowds ahead of us, forcing the ranks of people out of their path. I could just see the river down at the foot of the slopes, over the heads of the thousands of people trying to make their way down there. The water looked black, and the river was about 200 metres wide. There was a single bridge at this point spanning the width, the other bridges to north and south having been destroyed in April to prevent the Americans crossing. This bridge was a narrow wood and steel construction, and as we came onto the slope, I saw the reason for the so many people still waiting to cross over. The bridge was blown up in its central point, and only a single file of people could walk across to the American side, one at a time. The American bank looked largely deserted. There were no panzers or gun emplacements there, and no American infantry that I could see. I spoke to a lieutenant of an artillery unit beside me in the crowd, and he told me that the Americans had pulled their men back several kilometres to the west of the river. "They don't want a conflict with the Russians," he said with a shrug. "But look at all these people. There must be 50 or 60,000 people here. Will the Amis let all of us cross over to them?" I squinted down at the opposite bank. The line of people who had already crossed over the damaged bridge were simply fanning out across the grassland on that side, trudging off to the west. There was a huge pile of discarded small arms over there, carbines, rifles and machine guns, helmets and Panzerfausts, indicating that the troops saw no need of them when on the American side. I saw some men trying to swim the river against the swollen and fast-flowing current. Some emerged on the American bank, but many seemed to disappear under the dark water and not resurface. Someone had tried to make a boat out of a bridging pontoon, but this sank slowly as its crew paddled across, and the men slipped away under the water. Ahead of us, the SS men were beating a path through the crowds in their rush to reach the river bank. Shots were fired, and in a minute we stepped over the bodies of 2 artillery cadets who had evidently sought to argue with the SS. There were other bodies lying neglected on the ground, wounded men and civilians who had succumbed, and those in their final throes who had nobody to assist them. Lost children wandered through the thousands of adults, crying out for their relatives. The civilians in my column gathered up 6 of these children, and we remained together as we shuffled slowly forward to the bridge. On the approaches there were troops guarding the bridge itself, who sought to extort valuables from those people waiting to cross, in return for jumping forward in the crowds. For a gold watch, a good camera, or a diamond ring, you could go directly to the bridge itself without waiting. At first the people cursed these troops, but the sound of a bombardment from behind us, up on the slopes above the river, and the screams of the wounded from those explosions brought many offers of payment. The crowd was swaying, and people were falling underfoot and being trampled. From somewhere, a horse bolted through the crowd, kicking and trampling anyone who got in its path until it was felled with shots. When a red aircraft flew low overhead, not firing but low enough for us to smell the vapour of its exhausts, the crowd panicked and tried to storm the entrance to the bridge itself. Many people were crushed or trodden to death here, and inevitably it was the frailest and weakest who suffered the most. The banks of the river were steep clay cliffs, and many civilians fell into the water and did not resurface. In all this chaos, the remnants of my column clambered finally onto the bridge, and we began to walk across the planks in single file, with the water 20 metres below us, squeezing past the damaged section in the centre. Setting foot on the opposite bank was a strange experience. During everything we had seen and done in our breakout from the Kessel, the thought of the American side of the Elbe had been constantly in our minds. Now that we trod on the grass, without one single American soldier, Panzer or American plane in sight, the sensation was unreal, as if my feet were numb. With my crew and the fragments of infantry and civilians still with us, we left our pistols and other weapons on the pile of sidearms, a pyramid of gunmetal which rose to a height of 4 meters. All I kept was the photo in my pocket and the capo's iron cross on its ribbon, snatched from his body in the sunken road. As we turned to leave, a Kettenhund came staggering towards us. This man was drunk and waving a pistol at us. Our civilians shrunk away from him, while he gestured with the pistol at the medal in my hand. "I'll take that," he said with a reek of schnapps. "You didn't earn it," I said. "The American boys pay me $10 for an Iron Cross," he laughed. He used the American word, bucks, not dollars, as if he was now one of them. "I'll give you $2 for yours now so you can get a meal and a shave." Just as I hit him in the face, he shot me. That was the way my war ended, in May 1945, on the west bank of the Elbe, under American occupation but without an American in sight. After my 2 years of fighting, after Kursk and the retreat to the west, after the Halbe Kessel and the fields full of bodies, after everything I was ashamed of, and everything that I took pride in, my war ended with a drunken Kettenhund shooting a hole in my shoulder blade. As I lay on the west bank of the Elbe, watching the boots of my Panther crew as they kicked the Kettenhund man to death right there and then, I could only close my eyes against the sky and accept that everything that we had done was now at an end. My crew took me to a Red Cross centre in the American zone, an improvised hospital in an abandoned school building on the outskirts of Hanover. My injury was extensive, and added to the existing wound in my back, recovery was slow. I spent days in the grounds of the school building, listening to American radio shows and playing cards. At first, the food that we were given was so rich and sweet that it made me vomit, as my stomach was accustomed to Wehrmacht rations and water. We German men would stand at the table at meal times and shake our heads in wonder at the sight of the hot dogs, scrambled eggs and bread rolls, the biscuits and Hershey bars we could buy from the store. The nurses were Red Cross volunteers and nuns of various countries who could not be bettered anywhere for the care they gave us. My uniform was folded in a locker, and I took to wearing old civilian trousers and shirt which came from the hospital clothing bank. I shaved every day and smoked cigarettes in the sunshine. The patients did not speak to each other about their experiences in the war. Once I saw a new patient brought in who had been injured in a knife fight. I thought I recognized him as one of the SS men from the bridge crossing, but I said nothing about this, and neither did he. My Panther crew were dispersed to prisoner processing camps in the American and British sectors, and I heard that the civilians that had been in our column simply disappeared into the landscape of Germany. I was interrogated by an American sergeant who wanted only to know if I was a member of the National Socialists. He was less interested in my war record. There were simply so many of us to be processed. May 1945 turned to June, and then July. Now the wisdom of surrendering to the Americans was confirmed absolutely in my mind, because everybody knew that the information we had about our prisoners in the East was zero, literally zero. The millions of men who had surrendered to the Reds east of the Elbe had melted into the Soviet system, and nothing was known of them. Some people said that they were in the Central Soviet republics, places that lay beyond the Caucasus Mountains, and now might just as well be on the moon. Other people said that they were in Siberia or Mongolia, from where, the Hiwis and Red prisoners had always told us, not even Russians can ever return. We in the West felt vindicated in our determination to escape that fate, while many of us also felt uneasy, knowing that luck had played a large part in our diet of hot dogs and chocolate. At the same time, the future of the western part of Germany was becoming clearer. The Western Allies were investing in rebuilding the cities they had destroyed. Anything could be bought for a price: coffee, cosmetics, guns, gasoline, morphine, colour magazines, cameras, bourbon. I was offered a jeep if I could scrape together 10 Iron Crosses plus Luger pistols to go with them. They gotta be Lugers, my American contact insisted. Walters won't do it. The streets were full of German girls walking with American GIs and glum German boys watching them pass. The atmosphere in the streets, strangely, felt like some time before the war, when the future seemed full of possibilities. My future, though, was uncertain. My only remaining family had been the Wehrmacht, and I had no home, no occupation, and no resources. At night, the hospital ward was full of weeping and cries, as the men dreamed of their battles. Some nights I did not let myself sleep, knowing I would see the Halbe Kessel again, and above all the dead Russian man in the cellar, whose friend gave his steel helmet to the German child. Why did that one Russian visit me at night, after all the scores that I had killed, the thousands that I had seen killed? Because I showed him the photo of the girl in my pocket. Was that why? I lay on the bed, in my own personal Kessel of the mind, wondering about all this. I knew the time was approaching for me to leave the hospital. One by one, the wounded German men that were in the hospital were able to leave, and most were discharged into the civilian population. The nurses saw that I was troubled by this, and they didn't understand why. "But you have your sister," one nurse said to me after changing the dressing over my shoulder wound for the last time, as we watched humid rain on the windows of the ward late one afternoon. "Or is she actually your girlfriend, the photo that you keep?" I didn't answer. "What is her name, Wolfgang? You have never told us her name." The photo was in a frame on my locker. I made the frame myself from pieces of a medical box, and fitted a glass over it from a piece that I found in the gardens. I looked at that photo each day, remembering the girl's mother and the way that she died on the rear deck of my Panther in the Kessel. To be frank, I had started to imagine a new life with that girl and the remnants of whatever family she had, to replace the complete absence of family in my life outside the Panzer troops. If I must be honest, I had spent my time in the hospital imagining my future life with that girl, and a house that we might have in the American sector, and me finding a paying job, maybe working with machines. Any solitary man knows the kind of thoughts that I had. "What is her name, Wolfgang?" I had no idea of her name, but there was an address on the back of the photo, in a town not far from the Elbe, and the more I thought about that girl, the more I thought that I should go and visit her. And so it was, at the beginning of August 1945, that I left the hospital in a civilian suit and tie, with a backpack and a small bunch of flowers that the nurses made for me, because they knew where I was going and why. I found a lift on a postal truck and then a farm cart, both driven by men my age who must surely have been in the war. We didn't ask each other for details, watching the streets full of people at work, clearing the mounds of rubble and putting their homes back together for the future. People stood in lines, passing bricks from hand to hand, while American bulldozers cleared whole blocks, and American trucks brought in whole loads of timber and concrete to build everything again. Had the Americans forgiven us then? It seemed that they had, and it felt to me that the Halbe Kessel was now in the distant past, and that its secrets would be locked for all time in the forests east of the Elbe, and in the minds of those who had witnessed those events. America was our future now, America where anything could be forgiven, forgotten, and lost. As the cart halted outside the address, I felt that this was my future too, this new world of building and forgetting the past. The house was shuttered and the doors were locked. My heart was pounding with apprehension, as it used to do before combat. Getting no answer from the silent house, I asked a neighbour if they knew of the girl, showing the photo in its frame. The old lady took me into her own house next door and sat me at a table in a darkened kitchen. "Is she still living there?" I asked. "Where is she?" The neighbour woman wrung a cloth in her hands. "The Americans have been very good to us," she said. Yes, I see that. But this young lady? The Americans have been generous and have restored order. We are very lucky here compared to those in the East under the Reds. What the women have suffered over there, it is indescribable. Yes, we are lucky. I myself made great efforts to reach the west, to escape the Reds, I told her. Now I see that the journey was worthwhile. But this girl, where is she? We have no complaints against the Americans, young man. It is to be expected that in any army there will be 1 or 2 bad apples, a small number of problem soldiers. I am sorry, young man, but the girl in your photo is no longer with us. She has left? She is dead. It is very regrettable. In any army, there will be 1 or 2 who do not obey the law. We are lucky that the Americans have so few of these, compared to the Russians. You must not be angry, and you must not look for revenge, please. The fact is that the young lady was killed by an American soldier some weeks ago. If you must know the details, he was drunk and forced himself on her, and then he strangled her. But the law has been applied, you see. The man himself is in their military prison, and it is said that he will hang for the crime. Our mayor is very close to the Americans, and he says that the man will surely be hanged. But such events are rare. They are almost unheard of in the American sector, as you can imagine. We must all try to forget this event now, because it is not good to remember these things for long. I nodded in the darkened kitchen, listening to the sounds of the reconstruction outside. I walked away from the house in the sunset, through the summer fields, not knowing where I was going next. In these meadows there were junkyards of armoured vehicles, where long rows of our panzers were lined up in the grass, rusting, abandoned and silent. The little Hetzers, the Stugs, the great Tigers, the great Panthers, all waiting in the sunset, empty, row upon row, leaking oil, with birds making nests in their turrets. It seems that when a war ends, there is too much metal left over, too much steel, and all the panzers lose their value. Truly, the neighbour lady was correct. It is not good to remember these things for long,